The Auxiliary Bishop of Los Angeles is with us today. Bishop Barron, you and I were both ordained as bishops less than 1 year ago. So we both qualify as baby bishops. But I've attended the school and you haven't yet. But if you want my notes, you can have them so you can pass. You are a skilled educator and evangelist. We appreciate your many years of teaching the faith with new technology and media. It is good to have you with us as well. We look forward to your address to us later this evening. Welcome, Bishop Barron.
I was out to lunch with this friend of mine, an older priest friend, and I was carrying on in this vein. You know, we had Fulton Sheen, who was the great hero, but then we dropped the ball, and our Protestant friends have so, outrun us, and we're behind, and blah, 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 blah. For an hour I talked. Until he looked at me and said, well, what are you doing about it? And I remember distinctly, I said, well, I'm a professor of theology, and I'm writing books, and he goes, yeah, but then that's not what you're talking about. Put your money where your mouth is. And so honestly, that got in my craw, I must admit. So what I did is I went, just a few weeks later after that conversation, I went down to WGN Radio, which is the biggest radio station in Chicago. I thought, why not just go for the top, So I said, what would it cost, or would you have room, for like a sermon program on WGN Radio? And they said, oh yeah, we have a good time, 5:15 Sunday morning for 15 minutes. So between 5:15 and 5:30, at which point the Lutheran hour took over till 6:30. So I said, well, and how much would that be? And they said it'd be $50,000 for the year. So, okay, and I went first to the Archdiocese. I shouldn't be laughing, but I went to the Archdiocese, and I laid this out. I said, hey, is there any chance? And they said, no, but if you raise the money, we're behind you all the way. And I shouldn't be making fun. I'm really not making, the church has got a lot of financial burdens now, et cetera, et cetera. So they said, go raise the money. So I went to the parish I was helping out at on the weekend, which was a well-to-do parish. And I told them what I just told you, this very story. And I said, I need $50,000. And they gave it to me. We raised the money. My first inkling, by the way, by direct experience, that the money is there. That if you tell the good people of God about a project that they get and they think is worthwhile, the money is there. Anyway, the money came forward. I got on WGN Radio. I was on for a year at 5:15 a.m. I got a lot of letters from truckers. I'm not kidding. Truckers going by the 294 would hear me, at 5:15. Well, then we expanded a little bit. Do you have Relevant Radio here in Pittsburgh area? Yeah, so Relevant Radio, which is a national or kind of semi-national Catholic radio network, picked up the show. And then we started doing some DVDs of a lot of these retreats and talks I'd been giving around the country. We filmed. And then EWTN picked those up. And that was kind of a breakthrough moment because that sort of raised the profile higher. Around this time, and here I want to pay tribute to Cardinal George, and not just as a personal tribute, but in light of what Cardinal Wuerl mentioned last night, of the role of bishops in all this. Right around this time, I'd been on a trip somewhere, and I came back to Mundelein Seminary, and there was some big to-do going on, and I went over to the cafeteria, and there was Cardinal George, and he saw me, and he said, oh, I want to talk to you. Always a bad sign, by the way. And here's what he said to me exactly. He looked at me and he said, I want you to jumpstart evangelization. And I looked at him blankly, and then I said, you mean you want me to run the office of evangelization? No. I don't want you to run the office. I want you to jumpstart evangelization. And still looking blankly, I said, well, what does that mean, Your Eminence? And he said, I don't know, but I want you to do it. I'm not kidding. And then what he did, it's really one of the great graces of my life. He said, I want you to step away from the seminary for a while. I want you to come and I want you to live down at my house, and we're going to work together on this project. So out of the blue, like that, Cardinal George kind of drew me into his household, and then together we began thinking this thing through. And again, just a tribute to Cardinal George, who's been gone now just over a year, and proved to be a tremendous mentor to me, and still it's someone I invoke in prayer every single day. Maybe it would happen once, maybe twice a week if we were lucky, where our schedules would mesh and we'd be there at the same time for dinner at his house. Dinner with Cardinal George. How many have been through a doctoral defense in this room? I mean, when you're the one defending, that's what it was like. Now, without the terrible pressure, but the joy of the intellectual combat. If you made a statement at Cardinal George's table, you better have your footnotes in place. I mean, you better be able to tell him where you got that from. They are some of the great memories I've had in my 30 years as a priest, are those very lively conversations with Cardinal George. Well, in the course of one of those, he said to me, I was with John Paul II. Now, John Paul II was his hero. He was the hero to Cardinal George. And he was there for the ad limina visit, where you report on your diocese. And so he laid out all the facts and so on. And John Paul listened politely. And then John Paul II, his hero, turned to him and said, what are you doing to evangelize the culture? Which, is John Paul's great theme. And now, if you know Cardinal George, he was never at a loss for words, right? One of the most articulate people I've ever met. He said he was at a loss for words. There he was in front of his hero, and he didn't quite know what to say. So one night at the table, he said, that's what I want you to do. I want you to evangelize. And that's called passing the buck, But that's what we talked about a lot at the table, was the evangelization of the culture, and that's where a lot of this work came from. At the table tonight, we mentioned the great Bishop Ray Geddard. Now, most of you don't know Bishop Geddard. He's now about 90, and a retired, much beloved auxiliary bishop of Chicago. Great man, very holy man, and a meat and potatoes Chicagoan, I don't think Ray has cracked a philosophy book in 70 years, but a good guy. Well, he's so good that he would never excuse himself from the table when the cardinal and I would start talking about philosophy. He would just sit there politely, So one night we were talking about, I remember it was Husserl's phenomenology in relation to post-modernity. So the cardinal and I were talking about that. Well, anyway, so poor Bishop Geddard patiently sat through the whole boring conversation. And then as we're going up the stairs, he said to me, well, I don't know what the hell you two were talking about. But you made me miss the Wheel of Fortune. So that was life in the Cardinal's house. God bless him. He's a great man, still going strong at 90. Anyway, so Cardinal George, what he wanted me to do at first was to go downtown in Chicago, and it was very much avant la lettre, it was a Pope Francis move, that we would address the business community, not by having them come to us, but we'd go to them. So we sponsored luncheons in a room like this at some of the big business clubs downtown, University Club, Union League Club. We had a lunch, and then I would get up and give a half-hour, punchy little talk, no Q&A, so people would get right back to work. And so for 2 years we did that. I spoke about God, about Jesus, about the church, about sacraments, about the church's social teaching, et cetera, et cetera. And they were great. I enjoyed them very much. But I said to the Cardinal, there's something charmingly 19th century about this. It's something John Henry Newman would have done, to gather people in a room and give a talk. And I said, there's so much more we could do, Your Eminence, if we use the media, especially these exploding new media, right? Well, Cardinal George never used email. He learned how to type on a manual typewriter. So he didn't know that world directly at all, but he got it. And he said, basically, go, The first thing we did after that commission were the YouTube videos. And I know some of you have watched the YouTube videos I've done. YouTube started in about 2006. And I remember when it first started, it was like this anomaly, this sort of novelty act. And people would have film of my cat jumps off the roof and it would get 500,000 views. Well, I remember thinking, well, why don't we try something here? Why don't we try it? Make our video. And I'll talk about the culture, pop culture, the high culture, movies, books, music. And let's see if we can find semina verbi. Now, there's a term from the church fathers that I've always loved, right? The seeds of the word, the logos spermatikos, the Greek fathers call it. The seeds of the word that are present in the world. And if they're watered properly, can grow into Christ, So can we look around the culture, I wagered, and find signs that we could work with? So the very first one I did, if you go back, it's February 2007. I did a little video on Martin Scorsese's movie, The Departed, which had just come out. I'd just seen it. And I talked about evil, or the way evil works its way into our institutions, something like that. But it was me sitting in a chair. We had a little bit of a Siskel Ebert thing. Do you remember that show, the movie reviewers, that I'd be there in a theater kind of setting and talking about movies? Well, when we first did those things, I had zero idea if anybody would watch. None, zero. My mother never watched. I thought maybe my mother would watch, but she's never watched one. My mother one time said to me, Bobby, don't you think you're a little overexposed? Which I think is probably the voice of the Holy Spirit coming through my mother. Anyway, I remember distinctly when our team was thrilled when we got like 300 views on a YouTube video. Yeah, we got to 300. Well, what happened was, though, in a fairly short time, the audience began to grow. And it began to grow, and this was a grace, because I didn't know this at first, but the YouTube videos, people can comment on them. So I put this thing out there, and then suddenly comments are appearing. And I thought, oh, goody, a comment. Well, the comments on YouTube, to this day, 90% of them are negative. People that hate God, they hate the church, they hate me, they hate priests or whatever. And at first I was put off, I'll confess that. But then in time I thought, this is really good. This means we are getting way outside the walls of the church. Talk about, and I'm not going to get the direct smell of the sheep, but talk about smell of the sheep, because we're getting way outside the sort of tidy boundaries of our Catholic world. Nothing wrong with that world, but I wanted to evangelize outside those walls, and this was very clear evidence that we were reaching them. Furthermore, I have what the French call the joie de combat, the kind of the joy of the battle. All right, you make a comment, let me answer you, And then that would awaken another response. And in some cases, I don't do as much anymore, I don't have the time, but in those early days, I would get into these kind of lengthy and sometimes very complex conversations around these issues of God and morality and virtue, et cetera, et cetera. And I loved that. And see, that brought the audience up higher and higher because people would get on to follow these conversations. Proud to say we're very close to now 18 million views of these YouTube videos. So over time, they built up to an impressive outreach. And I love this, YouTube will give you the demographics very clearly of who's clicking on these things, who's watching. Men in their 20s and 30s watch them. Thank God, because talk about a group that we have a hard time reaching, the Catholic Church. Young men in their 20s and 30s watch these videos. And you can tell from the comments, they're all macho, masculine, young guys want to fight with me. Good. I like that sort of evangelization. So the YouTube videos allow us to do that. Well, once those got going, we then had a meeting of our board, I remember, the Word on Fire board. And I was laying out what we've been accomplishing, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the board members looked at me and said, well, what's your dream project? If you were just dreaming, go crazy, what would you do? And I said, very spontaneously, well, I would do something like Kenneth Clark's Civilization. Remember that? Some old enough to remember that show from the 70s. The great Kenneth Clark, the art historian, did this show called Civilization, where he went around to the great monuments of Western art and architecture and so on. And then he talked about what it meant to be a civilized person. And I loved that show, and the book had a big impact on me when I was a kid. I said something like that, but about Catholicism. Because I remember saying, we got a beautiful religion and we got a smart religion. And I want those two elements to come out. And now, mind you, this is 2007, 2008. 2002 was the height of the sex abuse scandal. We're still in the wake at that time of the single worst thing that's ever happened to the American Catholic Church. We've all lived through it. Extraordinary. The worst time. Worse than the 19th century. Burning down convents and all that. The worst period in American Catholic Church history, no question about it, is what we just lived through. I thought, what do you do at a time like this? I wanted to bring forward the truth and beauty of Catholicism. So anyway, I laid that vision out. They said, well, why don't you do it? I said, well, I can think of two reasons right away. I'm a teacher at the seminary, and I've got to do that, and we don't have enough money. They said, well, we'll work on it. So 4 members of the board, I didn't go with them. They went down to see Cardinal George, and they sent him some information about it, and they said, we want to talk to you. They told me later, Cardinal George walked in the room, and he had their material like this. And before he sat down, he said, whatever I have to do to make this happen, I'll do. So we got that. Cardinal George was behind it. He said, I'll keep him away from the seminary or free him up, all that. Now all we had to do was raise $4 million. So we had contacted the production company led by Mike Leonard. Some of you might remember Mike. For 25 years or more, he was a correspondent at the Today Show and did these kind of human interest pieces. And he was from the parish that I would go to on the weekend. And Mike has a production company, and we approached him, and we asked, what would this cost, roughly, if we're doing a 10-part round-the-world thing? And he gave us the $4 million figure. But Mike opened all kinds of doors, because Mike, NBC. We had NBC fixers on the ground. We had NBC connections, NBC camera people, NBC cinematographers. So that was a grace of God that he put Mike Leonard in my path. But we still needed that little $4 million. And I think it's an extraordinary part of the story, because at the time I wasn't that well known, and I was proposing this thing. I had nothing to show for myself except the YouTube videos and a few speeches, but I laid the vision out to Catholic lay people. There were no grants. We never got one penny of grant money of any kind. No institution really gave us money. It all came from private individuals at fundraisers. And I would lay out this vision of, your parents and grandparents used to invest in schools and parishes and seminaries. And I said, that's where the immigrant generation was evangelized. And they were indeed. But now, I explain, they're not coming to our institutions. This is, again, Francis avant la lettre. I mean, we got to go out to them. I said, and this is a way, if you want to reach people under 45, everyone's geared to a video world. Well, people got it. You know what I mean? They got it. And they began giving the money. Mind you, we started filming in 2008 for the Catholicism series, and the economy collapsed, of course, remember, in 2008. So a lot of our donors backed out. But when we got just enough money for a trip, roughly $250,000 to do a trip or an episode, we'd go. I said, well, let's just go and do it. And if it's 1 or 2 or 3, let's just do it. And all of us, I'll say this, all of us, we were on the same age. We were all like in our high 40s, early 50s. This is the cinematographer, the producer, the director, the camera people. We're all around the same age. And I didn't know how it would be used. I really did. I didn't know how, but I just felt this sort of compulsion to do it. And we all did. We just got to get this thing done. And so we scraped the money, and eventually we got the 10 episodes filmed. It then took about a year to do editing and music, and then it came out in 2011. All this time, we used to say, we'd love this to be at PBS level. It'd be great, like a PBS level documentary. Never dreaming for a second that PBS would ever play it, because it was very Catholic. So we got home, the thing was done, more or less. And I said, well, what do we have to lose? So we sent it to the local PBS channel in Chicago, WTTW. And I fully expected, thanks, but no thanks, or God bless you, but, we couldn't possibly play this. Well, a week later, they called and said, we'd like you to come down to talk to us. I said, that's got to be a good sign, So we got down there around the table, and they said, well, we love it. We think it's beautiful. We think it's compelling. We think people of any faith would find it interesting. And I remember distinctly, I said, You do? Oh, yes, I mean, of course you do, I was really, honestly, I was flummoxed by it. He said, we will take it, and then we're gonna syndicate it. So they syndicated it all over the country, and 260-some channels picked it up. Only 3 channels didn't pick it up. I won't name what cities they were. But only 3 said it's too Catholic for PBS. But 260-some picked it up. And then they did 4 of the series, and EWTN did the rest, which I'm very proud to say I'm pretty convinced it's the only show that's ever been shown on both PBS and EWTN, right? Which are usually mutually exclusive. So the series came out, and then, it's a constant source of joy to me to hear how it's been used. Because as I say, truthfully, I didn't know how it would be used. We didn't have any great plans. We just thought we need to do it. And it has been picked up and used, widely throughout the church and outside the church. That's brought people back to the faith. Now, I'm telling you this story under the rubric, really, of it can be done. It can be done. I think it just took some creative thinking on the part of people around me. It took the very active involvement of a great bishop, Cardinal George, who cleared the way and opened doors and so on. it also, and Word on Fire from the beginning, has been a great example, I think, of clerical lay collaboration. Because it's the lay people at Word on Fire, there are 12 people now that work there full time, that keep it going. It was the lay people who funded it, who gave me the money to get it off the ground. And I think working together, we did something in the wake of this painful time in our history, you know. So it's a little maybe rah-rah to everybody. There's no reason why we can't, I think, be creative and try new things. And even a PBS, you know, could look at the wealth of Catholicism and say, hey, this is worth showing to a wider audience. So anyway, that's the point of the first part of my talk, which leads me to part two. The fruit, in many ways, everybody, of the last many years of the work I've been doing is that we need a new apologetics as part of the new evangelization. Now, mind you, I'm totally on board with the Pope Francis program of encounter and outreach and emphasizing the positive. You notice, for example, in the Catholicism series, I don't say one word about birth control. I don't say one word about abortion. I don't say one word about gay marriage. Now, there were a lot of people that were saying, oh, you need to have an episode on the hot button issues. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. Because I think we get stuck. I want to lead with the beauty of the faith. I want to draw people into it. Because my conviction was, if you're teaching people baseball, what don't you do? You don't start with the infield fly rule. You know what I'm saying? You don't start with a particular rule. You start with the beauty of the game. Hey, look at this game. Look at the great players. Look at that field. Look at Wrigley Field. I'm a Chicago, bias here, but look at baseball. Watch it. Play it yourself. And then you will tend to learn the game from the inside, right? So that was my instinct very much. So I'm totally on board with that. Having said that, I do think essential to the new evangelization is a new apologetics. Now, when I was coming of age in the years right after Vatican II, apologetics had a bad name. Apologetics sounded defensive, it sounded rationalistic, it sounded anti-ecumenical, it sounded like we were retreating into the Catholic ghetto, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I don't know, maybe that was true to a degree. But look at in the wake of the new atheist phenomenon. In the wake of September 11th, a lot of that happened. When the culture, in a rather dramatic way, turned on us. Now, couple that with the sex abuse scandal, and you've got a lot of the mess that we're in now, where the culture looks at Catholicism in a very negative way. What do we need? Now, you guys know this, that we're massively losing our young people. You know, the last stat from the Pew study, you follow those Pew Forum studies, the one that stays in my mind is the 6-to-1 ratio. Do you know what I'm talking about? Is that for every one person that comes into the Catholic Church, 6 are leaving. I mean, we're hemorrhaging people right now. And as you well know, a lot of them leave during their time in college. Dr. Wu mentioned the atheist clubs. I know about that, springing up in high schools and universities. I know from the YouTube videos exactly what's blocking a lot of people today, especially young people. So it's based not on surveys or just abstract theorizing. This is based upon a lot of experience in the trenches. And I identify 5 areas that people really get blocked on. Now, if I'm lucky, I won't get to we'll run out of time before we get to the 5th one. I'll show you why. Here are the 5. A deep misunderstanding of God. There's a deep misunderstanding of God out there, and that's blocking a lot of people. Number 2, there's a deep misunderstanding of the Bible and how to read the Bible. 3, a deep misunderstanding about Christianity's relationship to science. 4, a deep misunderstanding of the Bible and Christianity's relationship to violence. And then finally, the church's teaching on sexuality. Those are the big 5. You see why if I run out of time before getting to sexuality. As far as I'm concerned, based on 10 years of in the trenches research, what's blocking young people? God, the Bible, science, violence, and sexuality. Those are the big 5. So I promise I'm going to stay within the time boundaries. I'm going to be really brief with each one. The purpose here is just to give you a hint of the areas I think we should be looking at. First of all, God. There's out there a theory that I like that's called the Yeti theory of God. Remember Yeti, the Bigfoot, right? Well, Bigfoot, some say there's a Bigfoot. Some say there isn't. Let's find out. Let's investigate and look for evidence of Bigfoot. Does he exist or not? The assumption there is that there's this being out there somewhere in the world. There's this being among beings. And some say it exists and some say it doesn't. Let's go find out. Speaking now out of the mainstream of our great theological tradition, the one thing God is not is a being. Thomas Aquinas says that God is not an individual. God is not the ens summum, the highest being. God is not in the genus of being. It's a very interesting comment Thomas makes. You think about, I'm in the genus of humanity, and aren't we all at least in the genus of being? Aren't we all beings? Yeah, but God is not in the genus of being, says Thomas Aquinas. What does he mean? He calls God not ens summum, highest being, but rather ipsum esse subsistens, the subsistent act of to be itself. God's not one thing among many, however great. God is that subsistent, infinite act of being itself, in and through which all finite things come to be. Now, maybe you're thinking like Ray Getter right now, like, why is he giving all these abstractions? Atheism is predicated largely upon the assumption that God is a great competitor to the human project. Go back to Feuerbach, come all the way up through Marx and Freud and Sartre, Nietzsche, all of them, all the way to Christopher Hitchens. What do you find? God is a competitor to human flourishing. Feuerbach, the founder of modern atheism, said, the no to God is the yes to man. That's modern atheism, everybody. God is a threatening being that hovers over our freedom, threatens our flourishing. Same thing in Marx, same thing in Freud. Sartre said, if God exists, then I can't be free. But I am free. Therefore, God does not exist. Now those are high-level philosophical positions years ago. They're now very much in the common perception of people. God as a looming threat. What's the importance of saying that God is not a being, but being itself? It means that God is not competing with us on the same field. It's not a zero-sum game, as though if God gets all the glory, I need to be denigrated. If God gets the attention, I need to be marginalized. No. What did St. Irenaeus say? Gloria Dei homo vivens. The glory of God is a human being fully alive. Now see, everybody, there's Christianity, if you want, in a nutshell. There's Christianity. God's glory is that we are alive. He's not threatening our well-being. He's the condition for the possibility of our well-being. Here's just an image just to keep in your mind. Look in the ancient myths, the Greek and Roman myths. When the gods burst into human experience, what happens? People are incinerated. Right? When the gods break in, things have to give way. Now the Bible. Look in the 3rd chapter of Exodus. There's a bush that's on fire but not consumed. What does that mean? It means that when God comes close to creation, he makes it luminous and beautiful and does not consume it. Now, mind you, what's the name that God gives when Moses asks the commonsensical question, which one are you, right? So there are a lot of gods in the ancient world, and this is clearly a divine figure speaking to him. So he says, well, what's your name? Which one are you, see? And what's God's answer? Right, and see, that's the ground for Thomas Aquinas saying that God is not ens summum, highest being, but rather being itself. The very nature of God is to be. And that means the closer he gets, the more alive we are. That's the great answer to the atheist. Now, there's a whole theology behind this, but it's a path forward in dealing with this fundamental objection about God. Here's number 2. The Bible causes a lot of trouble, I find, for young people. What's the Bible? Listen to someone like Christopher Hitchens or Bill Maher. Do you guys watch Bill Maher? Man, talk about overexposed. I mean, that guy's on constantly. What's the Bible for them? Oh, pre-scientific nonsense, Bronze Age mythology, old myths and fables and legends, talking snakes and whales that swallow people up, and all these old fairy tales. And you religious people naively take all this stuff in as though it's, gospel truth. The Bible's made fun of constantly, I find, in these YouTube forums. How do you read the Bible? Well, here's a clue. The word, of course, comes from the Greek term ta biblia, right, which is a plural term. It means the books. The books. The Bible's not so much a book, but the Bible's a library. It's a collection of books written over a long period of time by a variety of different authors to very different audiences, to very different purposes, and using very different genre, right? Watching an atheist after atheist, the attempt to make the Bible a univocal text, to be read with one clunky set of interpretive lenses. Do you take the Bible literally? Well, my answer is, do you take the library literally? Well, it depends, man. What section are you in? What section do you wander into? You're in the history section, especially contemporary history. You might want to take that more or less literally. But you wander into the poetry section, you wander into mythology section, you wander into biography, et cetera, et cetera. It depends on what section you're in. The Bible, I try to explain to people over and over again, is made up of a wide variety of different genres. From saga, legend, yes. Quasi-history, yes. Theologically interpreted history, very often. Poetry, psalms, letters, apocalypse, etc., all different literary genres. See, I wonder if you agree with me. One of the problems I find is the breakdown in the humanities, where an awful lot of, especially young people, don't know how texts mean anymore. Do you find that? That there's such a dominance of science, and I'll get to that in a second, such a dominance of the scientific model that the binary option emerges of science or nonsense. But how subtly texts mean across a variety of genre is largely lost on people. But until you get that, you won't get the Bible right. I love this from William Plaker. Do you know him? Died just a few years ago, a great Protestant biblical scholar. He distinguished between what's in the Bible and what the Bible teaches. It's a very useful distinction, I think. People will always tell you what's in the Bible. They'll draw something out. That's in the Bible. But what does the Bible teach? That depends, Plaker says, on patterns, themes, and trajectories within the Bible, right? And I often find myself urging people to look at that. Don't take up any passage and tell me, well, here's what the Bible teaches. That'll never tell you the truth of it. But patterns, themes, and trajectories within and across the genres of the Bible, that will tell you much more accurately what the Bible teaches. And the last comment here is the necessity of reading the Bible in the church. Because I'll come back with this argument, they'll say, well, how do you know all this? Or how do you make these determinations? And I'll say, that's why you need to read the Bible within this grand and long and complex interpretive tradition that we call the church. I'll use the example of Shakespeare. Would you ever think it's wise to pick up Hamlet and hand it to a 17-year-old and say, just read it? You'll be fine. You'll be fine. Or pick up Moby Dick or The Wasteland of T.S. Eliot and say, just read it, you'll be fine. Come on. No, there's a whole family of interpretation around Hamlet and Shakespeare. There's a universe of interpretation around T.S. Eliot. And it's within that matrix that we understand these texts. A fortiori with the complex collection of texts in the Bible, to read it in and with the interpretive tradition of the church. I urge people all the time. Third major problem, Christianity in relation to science. Every day, I would say, I deal with some version of this problem. Christianity in relation to science. Again, what's religion? Bronze Age mythology, texts written when people had no idea what a bacterium is, ancient nonsense, blah, 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 right? One of my great professors, he's still alive at Catholic University, it was Robert Sokolowski, one of the really great Catholic philosophers, I think, still writing today. He told us years ago, and I found this borne out over and over again, that modernity needs to tell its own myth of origin over and over again, almost in a ritualistic way. What did he mean? The myth that modernity emerged only after a long twilight struggle against the obscurantism and superstition of religion, right? How often have you heard that story or seen it told? Only after this long, terrible struggle, read Dan Brown if you want a pop version of it. Only after this long, terrible struggle did the sciences and the liberal democracies emerge, right? Now, who's the tragic hero of this story? Galileo, whom I find mentioned almost every day on my YouTube forums in some way. Galileo, the heroic scientist who battled against these backward-looking clerics who were trying to stop him. Now, I won't dwell on Galileo, which is a complicated story in itself, but I tell people this. Galileo is one paragraph in one chapter of a very long book, the book of the play between religion and science. And to reduce that book to the one paragraph in the one chapter is beyond tragic. And then here's where the thing really gets problematic. Rampant among young people is what I would call scientism. What's scientism? It's the reduction of all knowledge to the scientific form of knowledge, right? Now, we all know, everyone knows, the sciences, thank God for them, have been massively successful, and their attendant technologies. I mean, who would we lionize in our society but, a Bill Gates and a Steve Jobs, the people that have given us the technology that we use. In fact, it's all around us. It's in my pocket here, Great. But I love what the Cardinal said last night in the clip that they showed. Sciences are wonderful, but they can't begin to tell you anything about what makes an act good or evil. They can analyze the Sistine Chapel ceiling, tell you what it's made out of. They can't begin to tell you why it's beautiful or what it means. They could analyze the ink on the page of Moby Dick, but they couldn't begin to tell you the purpose of that novel. They can't tell you, mind you, why there's something rather than nothing. See, all of those are extra scientific questions. But there's a tendency among the young people to reduce all knowledge to the scientific form, based upon the scientific method of observation and hypothesis formation and experimentation and repetition of experiments, et cetera, et cetera. Great method, super productive. The problem is a logical one, finally, because scientism is self-refuting. Like my saying, I speak no English. Right? It's a self-refuting statement. To make the statement is to undermine what you're saying. Scientism is not itself a scientific proposition. See what I mean? Is the view that all knowledge is reducible to the scientific form of knowledge is not something that the scientific method can generate. It's a philosophical statement. And so scientism undermines itself. See, again here, I do think the breakdown of the humanities is part of the problem. Is that we've so elevated the sciences in our culture, we've so lionized scientists, that we've forgotten other paths of knowing. And see, I remember David Tracy, the great theologian, said that religion is a closer cousin to poetry than to science. And there's something right about that. That if we try to relate it all the time to science, we're going to miss something. It's a closer cousin to the way poets know. And then here's a last thing. I think a far more compelling story of origin is not the modern myth of the twilight struggle against religion. I think rather the physical sciences emerged where and when they did precisely because of Christianity. Now, many people have rehearsed this story, but I think it's a compelling one. Namely, they had to come out of a matrix that took the doctrine of creation seriously. Now, why? Why? If you take creation seriously, the first thing you know is the world is not God. Right? It's not divine. And from ancient animisms all the way to Star Wars, you have this view of like the divinity of nature. No, but if nature's a creature, we don't worship it. We are permitted, in fact, to observe it, to analyze it, to dissect it, to experiment upon it. It's not God, it's a creature. Second presupposition that makes the sciences possible, the assumption that nature is radically intelligible. Right? Whether you're a psychologist, you're a biologist, you're a chemist, you're a physicist, the one thing you have to assume is the being you're going to meet has an intelligible structure. That's a strange thing the more you think about it. But all of science takes it for granted as an assumption. Where'd that come from? In the beginning was the Word. And through that Word, God spoke the world into being. What does that mean, that symbolic language? But that all of nature is imbued with an intelligibility that comes from God. Those two assumptions, the world is not God, the world's intelligible, made the sciences possible. Therefore, I would say don't urge the war of religion and science, but urge this great congruence between the two. And then I remember some years ago I did a video, and I was so happy we found the picture of this fellow. How many of our young people know that the formulator of the Big Bang Theory, right, which everyone takes for granted now, the Big Bang Theory of cosmic origins, was Georges Lemaitre. Georges Lemaitre was a Catholic priest. And we found this wonderful picture of him with Einstein, because he had to convince Einstein. Einstein didn't think the Big Bang was right. And Father Lemaitre convinced him. Well, the picture, he's got a Roman collar that's about 8 inches high, this giant collar, and there he's next to Einstein. How many of our young people know that? How many of our young people know that precisely at the time of Galileo, so many of the early pioneers of the sciences were priests? Anyway, don't get me started on that. But these fundamental assumptions about scientism, I think we have to keep going on that. All right, I got one more, and then I'll run out of time before I get to sexuality. So we got God, we've got the Bible, we have science. The next one, again, I'd say practically every day I hear it. Christianity, biblical religion, is violent. Now, this objection, I think, came from September 11th. It was revived, I should say, revived by September 11th. What did people see? They saw an old Enlightenment principle on display, namely that religion is irrational, therefore violent. See, religious people, you can't adjudicate your disputes rationally, you people, so all you've got recourse to is violence. Go back to Leibniz, Spinoza, Kant, Hegel, Thomas Jefferson. You'll find that argument in the early modern period. It was revived. Now read Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins. Revived in our time by September 11th. One thing I found is the opponents of religion, man, do they know the violent texts of the Bible? They don't know the Bible real well, but they can cite chapter and verse of the violent texts in the Bible. Their favorite is in 1 Samuel. When Saul is removed from his kingship. Now, why? Remember? Because he wouldn't put the ban on the Amalekites. And the ban meant kill everybody. Men, women, children, and animals. So Yahweh gives that command to Saul, kill everybody. And so he conquers the Amalekites, and he kills almost everybody. But he leaves a few, including King Agag, the king of the Amalekites, and a few of the animals. Well, who shows up? Remember the scene, the prophet Samuel. What's this I hear? He hears the bleating of animals, and he hears the talking, and he sees Agag, the king. What's this? Oh, Saul says, well, I basically put the ban on him, Samuel, but I kept a few. And then Samuel declares that Saul is no longer king. And then it says, took a sword, and he hacked Agag to pieces. The word of the Lord. Trust me, all the opponents, they know these texts in the Bible. And we know them too. Pope Benedict called them the hard texts in the Bible, these hard texts. Okay. Every day I hear someone say biblical religion is violent, and that's why it gives rise to so much trouble. Okay. Let me just give you one path on this, one path. It's a complex thing, obviously. Go back to the 3rd century and the great Origen of Alexandria, one of the greatest of the church fathers, who understood this problem in his bones. Origen knew the Old Testament really well. He also knew Christ. And he said basically, how do you reconcile these texts with the crucified Jesus? Here was Origen's answer, which I think is still compelling. Remember Plaker's thing about trajectories within the Bible. Don't take a particular text out, but look at themes and patterns and trajectories. What's the ultimate trajectory of the whole Bible? Origen said. The last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation. Remember the scene, they're up in the heavenly court, and a scroll is presented that's sealed with 7 seals. And the scroll represents, you could say, the whole of the Bible or the whole of history. And who will unroll the scroll? Who will read it? And no one appears. And so the visionary begins to weep, That's the way a lot of us feel, by the way. Who will read this text? Who understands what it's all about? And then we hear the Lion of Judah is coming. Great, the lion's coming to read this thing. And out comes, remember? This little lammy pie, a little lamb comes out. And I'm saying it that way because the Greek is the lamb standing as though slain. So out comes the weakest animal you could imagine, a little lamb who's been slain. The weakest image you could come up with. Well, of course, he's talking about Jesus crucified. And it's the lamb standing as though slain who alone can open the scroll. Now, what's the message Origen says? It's only from the standpoint of the crucifying Jesus that the whole of the Bible is rightly read. Don't read the Bible apart from that interpretive lens. If you do, you will misread it. Now, what did he draw from this? Now go right back to Agag and Samuel. Origen said we must read these great texts as metaphors of the struggle against evil. How do we deal with evil, most of us sinners? We deal with it the way Saul does, right? God says, put the ban on it. And we say, oh, okay, for the most part, but I'll keep a little bit here on the side for myself, right? I won't entirely eliminate this wickedness or this evil, but I'll keep a little bit. Suppose I went to Archbishop Gomez, my new boss out in L.A., and I said, Archbishop, I love being a bishop, and I love my new life out there, and I'm confirmed in my priesthood after 30 years, and that's why I'm celibate 90% of the time. Right? Or, honey, I love you with all my heart. You're my whole life, which is why I'm faithful to you, 75% of the time. Would you be happy with that? The doctor says, yeah, we got 90% of that cancer out of you. There are certain forms of evil that have to be done to death. You got to wrestle all the way down. They've got to be eliminated, not played with. Does that make sense? You got to hack Agag to pieces. See, that's how he interprets that. Now, keep the crucified Christ in mind. What do you see in that image? There's the lamb slain. What you see is the Son of God going all the way down. Think of Frodo going into Mordor, right, in Tolkien's great imagination. What does Frodo have to do? He can't mess around with it. He's got to go all the way down. All the way down. Jesus fought sin and death all the way. He hacked Agag to pieces. And that's why he's Christ the victor. Not Saul messing around. Not the king that's playing around with evil, but the king who truly conquered sin and death. That's Origen's ancient 2nd century, early 3rd century reading of these still puzzling, problematic texts, but at least I think it shows a way forward. Honestly, I'm going to stop. Maybe in the Q&A, you can ask me a thing about the last. The 5, again, just to review them, and I'll close with this. Can I recommend to all of you in your campus ministry? It's based on 10 years of smell of the sheep, in the trenches, work with people. I think if you put a program together with these 5 themes, I think you get a lot of kids and a lot of interest. Get your best person in your campus or in your part of the world on God, to talk about God. What does God mean for serious believers? Get someone now, your best Bible person, maybe at your university or somewhere nearby. Get your best Bible person, how to read the Bible. Thirdly, get a scientist. We got one at this table right here. Get a scientist who still has the faith and to talk about religion and science. Maybe talk about Galileo. Maybe talk about the origins of the sciences, etc. Maybe bring another Bible person back and talk about violence in relation to the Bible. And then lastly, someone to talk about the theology of the body and human sexuality. I think those 5, you're going to find people coming to the talk, and we'll find it compelling. And then the very last thing I absolutely promise now is just to leave you with a sense of hopefulness, I hope, about what we can do. Go back 16 years or so. I mean, I saw none of this on my horizon, the Word on Fire work, none of it, until that priest challenged me. And I think it was the voice of the Holy Spirit kind of saying, all right, buddy, stop complaining and do something about it. And I think if you do, and you do it with confidence, intelligence, and panache, I think people respond, and they'll come and join you. And I think, friends, we all have to do it if the work of the new evangelization is going to go forward. So, God bless you all. Thanks for listening. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks very much.